Hey guys, so Nilou is out and I obviously had to pull for her. I mean, her design and concept is just too stunning. But in this video, we're going to find out whether Nilou is a skip and whether or not you should just get her during her rerun. I've been looking forward to Nilou for a while now, but I'm hearing that she's a hard skip because of this and that reasons. So this is going to be a showcase / review. We'll break down her kit and we'll also talk about her strengths and weaknesses. Hopefully by the end of the video, you'll get a clear idea whether to skip her or if skipping her is going to be a mistake. This is Royal Regalia, and without further ado, let's begin. Nilou is a Hydro Sword character with two very unique passives which highlight her role very distinctly. Although following the theme of the recent Hydro characters, she takes HP scaling to the next level and is probably the hardest HP scaling character at the moment. Nilou's selling point is her ability to create bountiful cores thanks to her passive, which explode quickly and are much more reliable than the slow dendro cores that pop under the bloom reaction. This makes her what I would call a bloom enabler. I know, Hydro characters are all bloom enablers, but she was obviously designed to fill that role and perform really well at it. She has a 3-part elemental skill, which can be a little finicky to use, and has 2 separate effects depending on how you use it. This gives her a slight versatility, but not really enough to call her a versatile character. Her elemental burst has a really nice multiplier with a pretty high HP scaling, so she can somewhat burst, especially thanks to being Hydro, which gives her access to vaporize and freeze. But there are a lot of trade-offs you'll have to make if you really want to use her outside of a bloom focused team. And unfortunately at C0, she's not quite main DPS material in the traditional sense of the word because HP scaling characters share the same problem. Their auto attack talents are attack scaling and not HP scaling like the rest of their kit, which means you'll hit like a wet noodle when everything goes on cooldown. Although her skill changes that a little bit, she only has 3 attack strings, making her quite clunky for attack spamming. She also requires a little more attention than most other characters in terms of her elemental skill, as it's her source of Hydro infusion and needs to be managed properly. But thankfully, the rest of her kit works pretty nicely. After all, her main role is to supplement your bloom team, where you'll have to rotate between Hydro and Dendro characters. Nilou brings out the potential for bloom to become viable or at least more reliable, and I'll show you that as we go. But before that, we can't continue on without talking about her design. From top to bottom, she just looks extremely well designed. Genshin is of course one of the best games when it comes to character design, direction, and execution. Like the contrast between her red hair and the white-blue outfit, you know it's Nilou once you look at her. The attention to detail from her headdress with these horns and her skirt, which is inspired thematically by the lotus, is also quite stunning. She also has some really cute idle animations and dance-inspired combat animations, so there's no doubt many people will pull simply because of her design. On top of being an eye candy, her kit is also pretty interesting. As I mentioned at the start, Nilou is a bloom enabler, which means she helps teams bloom. Puns aside, she brings out the potential for pure bloom teams and makes them reliable, and this works all the way to Abyss 12 with certain conditions. Another way of looking at this, it means her role for now is quite niche or quite limited, unless you want to play with dendro cores. Yes, I'm saying this despite knowing that vaporize and freeze exist, but if we're talking about optimal, then Nilou's optimal role is in a team with only Hydros and Dendros, which means unless you encounter other sources of elements, you're not going to be vaporizing anything with Nilou under optimal conditions. That's not to say she can't work with a vaporize team or a freeze team, just that there are better characters for that. As a basic explanation, to trigger the bloom reaction and create these dendro cores, dendro has to react with hydro. Normally, you'll have to wait for the cores to explode after a while. The problem is, enemies might move away, resulting in damage loss. That's where Nilou comes in. Thanks to her passive, when her team is filled with at least 1 hydro and 1 dendro character and no other elements, these basic dendro cores turn into bountiful cores. These bountiful cores explode instantly and have much bigger radius and become a reliable source of damage. Both her passives actually affect dendro cores, where her first passive is to basically give that upgrade to create bountiful cores. The second passive gives it a damage buff according to her HP. This is her main selling point. You could change everything else, but these passives remain the highlight of her kit. Her elemental burst is a 360-degree AoE damage which has really good multipliers and coverage, and does damage twice. The second one happens a few seconds after the initial hit. This seems to be the direction Hoyoverse is going with the characters, where their burst damage is chunked and splitting the damage instances. I'm not sure if I like it, but at the very least her burst animation is great and it's pretty quick. The cooldowns and energy cost have pretty standard values at 18 seconds and 70 energy, which is kinda what Yelan has for example. This isn't the main focus of her kit anyway. It's mainly used to proc instant blooms when you need a hydro application, along with a bit of damage since it actually builds a lot of HP. A lot of HP and good multiplier means the damage is at least decent. Her elemental skill is a 3-part dance with 2 separate variations, sword dance and whirling steps. It can be quite finicky and a little bit confusing at the start, but basically the main difference is what you input at the 3rd step. You can input using either your attack button or your elemental skill button for all 3 steps, as long as you activate your elemental skill first. So in order to enter sword dance, your 3rd step has to be an attack input. So click with your mouse on PC or basically tap the attack button and you'll see this arrow icon and enter the sword dance variant where you get to keep your hydro infusion and HP scaling attacks with new animations for 8 seconds. This is useful when you want Nilou to do some on-field damage and have something applying dendro from off-field like Colet's burst. It also turns your 3rd attack into this illusion sword wave thing with higher multipliers and attack in a straight line, but the hitbox is not too great, so you'll want to position yourself as much as possible. To do the whirling steps variation, you have to press the skill input at the 3rd step, so basically tap the elemental skill button and you'll perform an animation with this waves icon and create a lotus around you for 10 seconds. This lotus created by whirling steps applies the wet status to enemies nearby and is a really good hydro applicator, which remains on the field even if Nilou isn't active. Depending on Nilou's role in your team, you'll probably use one or the other more. You can also kind of delay pressing these skills since the initial activation, or what they call the pirouette state, is active for 10 seconds. It's also worth noting that this is an 18-second cooldown elemental skill, and the effects don't last the entire cooldown duration, so there's quite a decent downtime, at least at C0. This skill is also what activates her passive, so you'll want this refresh at least every 30 seconds, which is the duration of the buff that creates bountiful cores, also known as the Golden Chalice bounty. This buff also grants your entire team 100 elemental mastery for 10 seconds, so not just Nilou, whenever they get hit by dendro. So if you're in the radius for the core explosion for example, that's considered as getting hit by dendro even though you take no damage. And finally, her normal attack talent has nothing of note. The multipliers are not that great, and she only has 3 attack strings, which can be quite clunky. You'll need the infusion and HP scaling from her sword dance variation if you're planning to upgrade this and use her as a main DPS. So talent priority wise, the elemental skill would have to come first, and then her elemental burst, and then depending on how much you think you'll infuse your weapon with sword dance, upgrade your basic talent as you see fit. We'll talk a little bit about Constellations before we jump into teams, builds, and playstyles. Whether you just want Nilou to apply hydro easily, or whether you just want her to become a dancing sword master, C1 is going to make her do those things much better. Both this and C2 will also bump up Nilou's ability to become a bloom enabler, reducing another 35% dendro resist whenever a bloom is triggered. Nilou and her team will also be able to apply a 35% hydro resist debuff whenever they deal hydro damage. This makes C2 a decent damage upgrade for a Hydro Dendro team, since there's only going to be those 2 elements in your team, and 35% is pretty much almost a free Viridescent Veneer set, which is not something you'll have access to since you're not running any anemo characters and you can't swirl. C4 is an elemental burst damage increase and an extra 15 energy for every time her 3rd step hits opponents. Remember that it has to hit them for this to activate, which is also going to be important for her weapon effects that we'll cover later. And C6 just seems to increase her own overall output again, but crit won't affect dendro bloom, so this is more of a DPS upgrade. So which constellation is necessary for Nilou? Honestly, C0 is more than enough. And if you really like her, but only care about value, you can try for C1 or C2. Anything past that is your call. Moving on to her team, playstyle, and build. To activate her passive, which lets her become a bloom enabler, your team will have 1 dendro and 1 hydro, and no other elements. This is nice because you can either run 3 hydro and 1 dendro, or 2 hydro and 2 dendros, though you'd never want to run 3 dendros. You want the hydro resonance because you want lots of HP in 1000 increments. But how much HP? Approximately 75,000 HP because her passive, which increases the core damage, is capped at 400%. You only gain 9% for each 1000 HP above 30,000, and 75,000 puts you at 405%. To achieve this, you'll probably need HP sets with really good HP subsets, something like the 2-piece Tenacity set to give you 20% HP, but this cap will be much easier to achieve if you have her weapon, which basically gives a total of 86.2% HP increase. Until they release another artifact 2-piece set with HP stats, the other set can be any elemental mastery set to help with bloom damage. It is also for the same reason that you run 2 dendros for dendro resonance, which will give you extra elemental mastery. The weapon effect on her 5-star weapon also synergizes with her elemental kit, giving her 0.12% of her HP as EM or elemental mastery whenever you hit an opponent up to a max of 3 stacks. It has to hit enemies, so swinging wildly won't give you the bonus EM. On the third hit, it also grants 0.2% of her HP as EM for the entire team. So while the text might look like 3 EM buffs, it is actually 4 EM buffs. 3 for her, then 1 for her entire team, which also applies to Nilou herself, making it 4. This is quite a substantial buff considering Nilou will probably sit at about 50k HP and ultimately want 75k HP for maximum dendro core damage bonuses. The formula goes like this, and at 50k HP, 1 stack is 60 EM for Nilou, 3 stacks is 180 EM, and the team-wide EM buff after the third hit is 100 EM, totaling 280 EM for Nilou and 100 for everyone else. At 75k, you get 50% more EM than at 50k, totaling to 420 EM for Nilou and 150 EM for the other 3 characters. That's a little bit more than the team-wide EM buff provided by Albedo's Burst. Without her weapon, you're going to have much less HP scaling, and less EM and no EM party buff from the weapon effects, but you can still at least improve her own elemental mastery. Some weapon choices include Iron Sting or Sapwood Blade as a free option, or any 5-star weapon with EM like Freedom Sword. Otherwise, you can use any 5-star weapon over 4-star weapons. Let's hope they release a 4-star weapon with HP scaling that's quite easy to access soon. As for her playstyle in this Bloom team, the main key is to keep creating bountiful cores. So you want to start with her skill for any battle, and then swap out to apply dendro. Get a feel for the timing when swapping characters, as you'll be swapping back and forth, leaving in different character skills and bursts. The good thing about using the Whirling steps variation is that you can apply Hydro with any character, whereas if you use the Sword Dance variation, you'll have to use her actively. This might work in future content where there are more dendro characters to choose from, but for now, the Whirling steps is still a much better option. For her Hydro partner, to activate Resonance, depending on how confident you are with switching and splitting the damage, you'll want to cover one of the worst parts of this team, which is single target damage. For that, I just have Yelan on my team since she's decent for single target thanks to her elemental burst. But if you're running a healer variation with Kokomi or Barbara, you may run into some problems with single target, so in cases like the Abyss, don't put her in a team that will deal with a lot of single target bosses. In the current Abyss example, which was a layout that reset on the 16th of October, you can quite safely run her on the first team because there aren't a lot of single target enemies, and Yelan can deal with most of them since they're not bosses. But since I don't run healers, I have to take these HP recovery cards whenever I get them, and it's pretty much a breeze clearing multi-target floors. A note, however, you might have an easier time if you actually have built characters, as both my Nilou and Tinari aren't even built, with Nilou having level 2 talents and a level 20 weapon, and Tinari's artifacts aren't even properly done. There are a lot of close calls in this Abyss, but I only needed to reset on this floor because of damage over time, which will sometimes invalidate running 0 healers, since there are stages that will constantly reduce your HP. A nice trick to know is to split or share the damage evenly, since Nilou and Yelan have a very high HP. You can switch to them when you know you're going to take a lot of damage and protect your dendro characters. But if Bloom teams can deal with many enemies, yet they tend to struggle with single target, would you consider Bloom to be viable? To me, if a team can clear the entire half of Abyss 12 without too much trouble, I would say they're viable to an extent. But because Nilou just released and Abyss floors sometimes have single targets on both halves, we might need more time and more dendro and hydro characters who can fill the role of either healer or single target in the coming banners. That's also another reason to be excited for the dendro Archon. If you have to decide between pulling Nilou or the dendro Archon, you might just want to sit on the safe side and skip Nilou for now and wait for her rerun. But if not, more power to you. Just know that Nilou fills a specific role and not exactly a versatile character. And while Bloom teams have become more reliable thanks to instant core bursts, I haven't really tested Freeze and Vaporize Nilou. This video was just meant to show you how much better Bloom is now thanks to Nilou. She's probably more for long-term players who have a lot of characters already and can be safely skipped for someone who recently started playing. But if you like her design, then pull for her because that's what I did. She's fun, pretty to look at, and I'm looking forward to the future dendro lineups. Hopefully, we'll get a decent dendro healer or defender type support, or maybe even a defensive hydro claymore character with HP scaling to complete her team. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.